Okay, kia ora koutou to everybody in this meeting today. It's lovely to have you all here to He Kaupapa Hononga's, I was going to say May, but we're not in May yet, April seminar, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Alex Mcmillan. Alex is a climate change and health researcher, a public health doctor and a scholar activist, and she works in the Department of Preventive and Social Medicine and is the co-director of Climate Health Aotearoa, and that sits alongside nicely He Kaupapa Hononga, and we often work together. So Alex is going to be talking about can lessons from a public health action on tobacco help achieve climate action, and we're all really interested to hear from Alex today. So I'll pass over and thank you very much.
O kia ora rā koutou katoa. Thanks for coming along this morning and the invitation. Ko Alex Macmillan tōku ingoa, he tangata Tiriti au no te whenua moe moe ahau no tāmaki makaurau ahau ko Otipoti te kāinga nai ane, and ngā mihi nunui ki mana whenua ki kaitahu ki Otago. So I'm going to talk a little bit, give a bit of an introduction to climate change and health, just for those of you who aren't familiar with the kind of overall summary of that, and then talk a bit about those lessons that we might take from action on tobacco, especially in the context of some of the really fascinating new statements being made in the IPCC, the latest IPCC reports, which I think are really important. So just a wee tiny bit of introduction to Climate Health Aotearoa, which is a multi-institutional national research group that is currently funded by an Otago research theme funding and part of He Kaupapa Hononga. It's a group that covers all of the climate change and people in the country who would say that they were doing climate change and health research, and it's been very purposefully founded on Te Tiriti and Matiki Mai principles, and so with co-governance and co-directorship, and about a little more than half of the members make up a tangata Tiriti caucus, and so we're deliberately shaping research in three spaces similar to Matiki Mai recommendations: a tangata Tiriti space, a rangatiratanga space, and a relational space. And there's the website there. And just to go back to that, sorry, there are three real areas that the group is focused on. There are really important health effects of climate change, health and health equity effects of climate change that are already locked in and happening. And I'll talk a bit about those. But there are also really important health co-benefits and health and equity co-benefits of climate action across all the sectors we need to address emissions in. And of course, the health sector itself both makes a substantial contribution to emissions in most countries, bigger than aviation, perhaps about 5 to 7% of a country's total emissions, as well as needing to adapt to the locked-in changes in terms of workforce and infrastructure and things like that. So just a little bit of a graphic summary of the effects of climate change on health through rising temperatures, increasing ocean acidification, sea level rise and coastal erosion, and more extreme weather events. From this graphic, you can see that they're really complex and they affect all kinds of different important health outcomes, whether it's infectious diseases, including the emergence and likelihood of emerging infectious diseases becoming pandemic, but also increasing risks from infectious diseases that we're already dealing with, like malaria, things like allergies and asthma, but also non-communicable diseases, mental health impacts, cardiovascular disease, but also more indirect effects on social disruption, civil conflict, and food insecurity. So really complex, big effects on health that are already we're already able to measure globally and starting to see in Aotearoa as well. The most important ones in Aotearoa at the moment are mental health effects, the disruption to food supply and food prices caused by severe weather events, both in the country and elsewhere, and issues, we already have a freshwater and drinking water crisis, with really big issues with waterborne disease and nitrate pollution, and those things will already getting worse as a result of climate change. But on this really exciting positive side, there are these opportunities to multi-solve climate change and our biggest killers and our biggest causes of hospitalizations and long-term morbidity. So if we look at this sort of big sectors we talk about that are that are where we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, in every one of those sectors, if we get our policies right and well designed and design them with health and well-being and health equity at the centre, and te tiriti and mātauranga Māori at the centre, then we've got these just amazing opportunities to address issues like the health outcomes of poor nutrition and lack of physical activity, air pollution, road traffic crashes, cardiovascular and respiratory disease, and cancer. And I'm going to focus on mainly on one of those sectors today, and that is the transport sector. But I think similar messages are possible across some of those other sectors. Interestingly, the latest IPCC report, health chapter, and there hasn't always been a health chapter in these IPCC reports, but the latest one had an increasing emphasis in particular on lowering the consumption of meat and dairy and plant-based diets as a real opportunity for reducing emissions and improving health and health equity. And it was fascinating to see what happened between the scientific statements about that in the main report and New Zealand's role in weakening the statements in the policy, the summary for policymakers as a result of lobbying. And that's that's what I'm going to talk a bit more about today, not from agricultural industries, but perhaps we can come back to that at the end. So I want to kind of talk specifically now about transport and oil and cars. And the reason I want to do that is because not only is transport our largest source of carbon emissions in Aotearoa, carbon emissions if we take it out methane, but globally the fastest growing sector in emissions, and it's the source of most of our the increase in emissions that we've seen in Aotearoa. And really that's about private car use. It is the majority of that, and the majority of the increase in emissions that's been seen globally over the last few years in the transport sector has been as a result of the increasing purchase of larger sort of light trucks in particular. So we might call them twin cab utes or large SUVs. And I want to be really clear from our research and from global research on on urban design and transport systems, that car dependence in cities has been a really deliberate strategy and a purposeful choice, rather than something that's being driven by consumer demand or personal desires. It's not only our largest source of carbon emissions in Aotearoa and globally the fastest growing source of emissions, but increasingly we're understanding in the public health domain that car use is also one of our most important kind of risk factors for death and serious illness. And so just this last year, my colleague Ed Randall in Wellington for his PhD was modelling just 3 of the many direct and indirect health effects of car use. He was modelling air pollution, traffic crashes and lack of daily exercise, and sort of modelled what if we could take out the car related causes of these health outcomes, what would happen to sort of health savings, and showed that we could save more than a million healthy, we would gain more than 1 million healthy life years over the life of the current cohort of the population. And even just modelling those 3 outcomes demonstrates that reducing unnecessary car use is as important for public health as policies to reduce smoking, which has been historically our largest sort of risk factor for death and disease. And that's just counting those 3. So once we put in sort of the health effects of car emissions from climate change, and all of the other sort of direct and indirect physical and mental health effects of car use, it totally blows smoking out of the water in terms of its importance as a public health risk factor. You can see this graph here that taking away the health effects of car dependence, and we can also reduce the transport systems baked in health injustices by income and ethnicity by reducing car dependence. We know that many households are forced into unsafe and unaffordable and unhealthy car ownership to stay in jobs at the cost of other health needs, as well as the inequities in these direct physical health effects. So what does the IPCC latest mitigation report say about transport? What do they recommend? And it's been really heartening to see a shift over time in these reports away from just replacing petrol cars with electric cars, because while that might reduce some greenhouse gas emissions at the tailpipe, it doesn't help us deal with any of the health effects of car use, apart from reducing air pollution a wee bit. It's been great to see them shift towards and avoid shift and improve prioritisation, where their top strategies are shifting, especially urban land use, towards increased density and enabling mode shift. Reducing trips altogether through things like telecommuting, but also an emphasis on active transport infrastructure and improving affordable, convenient, effective, low carbon public transport, but also increasingly talking about the importance of disincentives for car use, so increasing the price of car use and ensuring that we're shaping cities to disincentivize car use, and acknowledging some of the health and social co-harms of EVs, including the effects of mining for things like lithium. Unfortunately, though, while we're seeing a bit of a shift towards electric vehicles, at the same time we're seeing this overwhelming tendency to have bigger and higher emitting, less efficient and less safe cars on the road. And that's a global push deliberate push by car companies. This isn't about meeting consumer demand. This is about finding kind of legislative and tax kind of gaps, and then pushing these vehicles into those gaps. So at the moment, what we're seeing is this growth in the proportion of very large vehicles on our city streets that undermines all of those goals that we've just been talking about around wellbeing and fairness, and even probably overwhelms any of the emissions gains that we might be seeing from an increased number of electric vehicles on our roads. And so while in 2010, 4 of New Zealand's top 5 best-selling vehicles were cars, in particular small cars. The #1 seller was a Toyota Corolla, which is a small car. Now all of our top 5 top-selling cars are twin cab utes and SUVs, and they don't just have direct effects on health and emissions by being more dangerous for pedestrians and other vulnerable road users. But they also have these indirect effects by taking up way too much space on our roads that removes our ability to have room for things like cycleways. And in addition, they have this chilling effect on active travel because they feel so frightening to be around in cities, and often they block infrastructure like footpaths, and I'm sure that we've all seen this on Dunedin streets and been experiencing it increasingly over recent years. The most striking thing I think about the latest IPCC report on mitigation is the emphasis that was placed on misinformation, misleading advertising, and lobbying by vested interests, especially by the oil and car industries. And that the emphasis being placed by the scientific reports on this lobbying and the power of this political lobbying continuing to be a really major barrier to introducing life-saving climate policy. And that got more than 15 mentions in the latest report, but again was the statements themselves were watered down and weakened in the summary for policymakers by the lobbying itself. So similar to that, those plant-based diets changes. The approaches being used by these powerful vested interests in the status quo, especially oil and car industries, was the biggest emphasis. As well as the people being who are doing the work and the organisations who are being used to take these approaches represent a shared playbook between the tobacco and fossil fuel industries, and to some extent other climate and health harming powerful multinational corporations, which we might come back to. And I really love this. I mean, I hate it, but it's a great picture from Greenpeace's sort of analysis of how one particular multinational oil billionaires, the Koch industries, the Koch brothers, how they use their funding to undermine life-saving public policy via a range of different tactics, including sort of buying off the media and buying science to draw to grow doubt about climate science and health science, developing these pretend grassroots agencies, and having this kind of really close relationship with policymakers. The good news, though, is that in public health, we do have this history with tobacco and with at least making some headway in high-income countries on tobacco control and reducing health harm from tobacco that we can draw on, and that has had to involve addressing these same tactics by the tobacco industry. And so alongside other movements, I think that can be really helpful for addressing climate change. And those other movements include the things like the divestment movement from NGOs like 350.org, and other great work by people like Sarah Walton, who's here, on shifting business ethics and making these kinds of behaviours much more of an outlier in the general business world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the specifics of that for a moment. So what did we do about tobacco control? Well, there were lots of elements in tobacco control, but the main point I want to make, the overriding point, is that it was led by waves of government regulation and followed by shifts in social norms and social license rather than the other way around. So there were steps that government took to regulate, and then social norms and social acceptance followed when people were able to tangibly feel the benefits of those government actions. So then there were these kind of cycles of government action followed by a social response and social acceptance. And there are lots of kind of in the response, but I'm just going to talk about 4 of those today. The first one being that in the equivalent of the UNFCCC, which is the Climate Change UN Convention on Climate Change, the UN Convention on Tobacco Control includes this clause right up front that says that in setting and implementing public health policies around tobacco control, governments shall act to protect these policies from commercial and vested interests. So we had this really high level global promise and commitment to ensure that tobacco industries were not able to influence tobacco policy at a national level. And that has been really, really critical for governments being able to kind of close the door and not have the tobacco industry sitting around the policy table helping to make tobacco control policy. And similarly, there are carve-outs in multilateral trade agreements where around the UNFCCC, where lobbyists aren't able to use trade agreements to enable further tobacco growth in the tobacco industry. The second thing was the regulation of advertising and sponsorship of tobacco, and if we saw an advertisement for smoking or a sports team with wearing a tobacco industry t-shirt, now we would be pretty horrified, and that has such a low social acceptability as a result of that regulation, and to have like smoking being advertised during children's television would just horrify people. The Smoke-Free Environments Act was an act to protect people from passive smoking, and we all have, many of the older people in the audience may remember the shift in bars and public spaces where to being smoke-free and the effect that had on non-smokers' lives. I remember being pregnant when the Smoke-Free Environments Act occurred, and the bliss of being able to go and listen to a band in a bar, not to drink alcohol, but to go and listen to a band, and really feeling safe to do that while I was pregnant. And then this issue of taxing tobacco and recycling and hypothecating those taxes into supporting cessation, so supporting a shift away from smoking and paying for the harms of smoking. there's been some problems with those tactics and inequitable outcomes, especially around that fourth point, inequitable outcomes by income and ethnicity, where there's still quite a lot of health harm from smoking amongst low-income Māori and Pacifica people in New Zealand, and that's as a result of problems with how we've structured that recycling and shaping the effects of things like smoke-free environments. But as well as that, I've put this picture at the bottom, which is about the Bugger Up campaign. So some of these 4 po didn't get put in place without a fight, and one of the elements of that fight was that it was led by some Australian doctors who used civil disobedience and graffitied on a whole lot of tobacco advertising to point out the kind of dishonesty that was going on in that advertising. And so this the importance of kind of, I guess, professional civil disobedience and shifting government's willingness to regulate. So if we were going to think a little tiny bit about that in relation to oil and car use, there's already moves afoot towards these same po. At the moment, the UNFCCC has no clause about vested interests and lobbying at all. And we need to try and fix that by building that into successive conferences of the parties and the outcomes of those COPs, and the agreements that are being made during those COPs. And increasingly there is NGOs are lobbying to ensure that fossil fuel lobbyists and car company lobbyists are not allowed to come to the COP and influence the policies and agreements that get made there, but we haven't quite achieved that yet. When it comes to advertising, I think there is a reducing social license to see the kind of advertising that I've pointed out, just like a couple of examples of what I find is the most egregious ones at the moment, where I think we could start with regulation on advertising it. And there are some increasing moves afoot to do that. So the first one is, I think we could easily start with calling for a ban on advertising of oil and cars while we're getting our weather information on the Met Service app or on the news. That feels egregious to me and would make a lot of people, I think, now in society feel like that. We could press for a removal of their ability to sponsor our major sports teams, and I think there was quite a bit of outrage and outcry when INEOS became a major sponsor of the All Blacks. INEOS is a major petroleum and plastics company globally who now sponsor our most famous sports team. That it feels like a massive conflict for an organisation like the Otago Medical Research Foundation. Sorry, I've translated that picture not very well there. Our local medical research funder to be taking sponsorship from RD Petroleum, and we've been calling for them to drop that particular sponsorship. And there's increasingly globally movements by the media industries themselves, such as this Australian Comms Declare movement, to call for these bans on the advertising of the worst by the worst polluters and the companies who are behaving unethically. And it was heartening to hear that Yarra Council in Melbourne has been the latest council to declare a ban on advertising fossil fuels on its property. So you'll no longer see ads for cars on bus stations and on the backs of buses, which feels really sort of good. Yeah, that's an excellent move, but no council in Aotearoa has done that yet. Obviously, car-free environments legislation could be an equivalent to smoke-free environments, and we're already seeing cities around the world creating car-free environments that protect others from the harms of car use. I've deliberately chosen a picture here that has a whole lot of privileged white people in it. This is from Boulder, Colorado, because many of these, much of the implementation of car-free environments has been inequitable, and we need to ensure that the car-free environments that we are implementing and regulating for are te tiriti based in Aotearoa, are culturally appropriate and effective, and are targeted with the most funding and implementation towards the people who would benefit, the communities that would benefit most. And obviously, we are already seeing a push towards tax recycling into funding these sorts of things, but there needs to be a much greater and more effective move towards that. At the moment, still 70% of the money that funds our transport system, for example, is being spent on new roads and making things better for driving. And there needs to be much greater hypothecation of things like the money that comes from the ETS towards equitable investment in alternatives to car use. So I've talked about how oil and cars are bigger than smoking for public health, and I've shared that that fossil fuel companies and multinational car companies share what is truly a murderous playbook and resources with tobacco companies, but that effective public health oriented counteraction is possible when necessary, and given you some specific kind of first steps towards that. But that we need to learn from the equity pitfalls of the tobacco action that's been taken so far. I think I'm suggesting that societal readiness for at least some of the measures that we need to take is high. And while it's high potentially for around oil and the car industries, there is this massive elephant in the room in Aotearoa, which is that that industrial agricultural lobbying has used the same playbook, and that we do need to start to have a conversation about similar tactics around that too. So I'll stop there because I think I have gone a bit over time, but it'd be great to have some questions and discussion. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Alex. I'll just thank you very much. I'm sure that's been completely fascinating, and I've really enjoyed many of your graphics as we've been going through, with that, but as well as, of course, your arguments, which have much for us to think about. So I'll open up for questions. I have some, but I'll let other people go. Anyone questions? I've got the chat open if anyone wants to write a question. Sean.
Sure, Alice, how are you?
Hi, kia ora, Sean.
Yeah, I've got a question about Polly Higgins from the UK. George Monbiot wrote a Guardian article in 2019 talking about the lawyer Polly Higgins and her drive for an ecocide law. What are your thoughts about how an ecocide law, which will amend the Rome statute to make environmental destruction the fifth crime against peace, how effective would that be as a deterrent to the carbon emitters? In the context of the IPCC report.
Yeah, no, I think an ecocide law would be one really helpful piece to this puzzle that would enable judicial approaches to criminalising the kinds of behaviour that's being the unethical and immoral behaviour of these multinational companies. But yeah, definitely one piece in the puzzle alongside a whole lot of other things like the divestment movement in particular.
Kia ora. Marion?
Yeah, thank you very much for a really interesting talk. I am old enough to remember the smoking ban, but too young to remember how the public license for that was reached. So I want to have some whataboutism here along the lines of how do we get social license for banning things? So same as with advertising for alcohol, how do you get social license for banning advertising for cars and petroleum companies?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I want to re-emphasize that that what led to the growth in social license was a combination of government taking the first steps and communicating about it, but also that governments really use the most senior health professionals in the country. So in the case of tobacco, it was the Surgeon General or the Director General of Health to communicate the egregiousness of, for example, advertising cigarettes during children's television, or pointing out the most obviously sort of contradictory and harmful versions of that, which is why I think that health leaders taking leadership and communicating, for example, about the egregiousness of some of these things that I've pointed out here. How dare they, still be advertising the most emissions heavy vehicles while we're hearing about severe weather events caused by climate change? I mean, that's just obviously problematic and contradictory. So starting with some of those really most contradictory things that the public would be able to see as being really egregious and agree with, and then building from there in cycles of government starting and using health leadership, and then social license and public will following. And I just want to re-emphasize the order of that. Does that answer your question, Maren?
Yeah, I still have my doubts that I will not be brand marked as the fun police if I suggest this, but I hope we will get there eventually. Thank you.
I think there are small steps that I think people would be more willing to take. I think, yeah.
I'm just interested in picking up on that as well, Alex. In terms of, do you think it's a more powerful message or more palatable message in terms of the comment there about the fun police coming from the health authorities as opposed to climate change commissioner at those kind of avenues?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, public health is the fun police, right? but I think that the pandemic has shown us that messages from people like Ashley Bloomfield, the Director General of Health, are listened to and respected. And if Ashley came out and started speaking, talking about the fact that our car dependence is more harmful than the harms of smoking, and to begin to point out some of these worst examples, then I do think people would listen more than they listen to the Climate Change Commissioner. I do.
Yeah, and it just got me thinking then. Inga.
Thank you, Alex. That was great. Really interesting. There was a lot that I learned from that. I'm wondering about the UN Framework Convention. So I wasn't aware that because I've only ever looked at the climate change framework, that tobacco control had that no lobbying section in there.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how much of a fight it was to get it in there, because I'm trying to think of countries that are dependent on tobacco. I can't really think of them. Countries that are dependent on oil, I can think of them, and some of them are quite powerful. So how much of a fight is it going to be to get that kind of ban on lobbying in there?
It was a real fight. It was a real fight. And, I think that the first steps were to get the tobacco industry out of the room when they were negotiating the framework convention, right? And so that would be a really good a good first step. It is a fight. It is going to be a fight. And I think that there are a lot of global leading health people involved in that fight, and who really were willing to kind of stand up and fight that corner. And I think the more that the actual illegal elements of the way that these multinationals behave is exposed. So, for example, in tobacco, when it was exposed that the tobacco industries were lying to Congress, that was a really important step in being able to then have a statement like this in the convention. But we have that, like, it's not even needing to be exposed, it's all in plain sight, right? With the oil industry. And I think did I include a picture of, oh yeah, I mean, this guy, he was quite happy to talk to The Guardian recently about how he worked with the oil and tobacco industries and exactly what he does. And like, it's not a secret. And some of it is legal but amoral, and some of it is actually illegal. So the more we kind of find the illegal parts and bring it to justice, the more political will there is to block industry involvement in negotiating these conventions and policies.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, I'll just flick over to the chat. There's a bit of activity on the chat, and then I'll come back to Ariane. Duncan is asking, to what degree do you think businesses could play a role in stepping up, leading the change where governments are yet to act?
Yeah, Sarah, I think you probably know more about that than I do. I think it's hard, because I'd love to hear your thoughts. I do think that if the total kind of sum of business was increasingly causing these industries to be outliers, there is some reduction in social license around that. But at the same time, these are the most powerful multinational corporations in the world, and they have more power than many governments, and more kind of profit turnover, more economic power. And I'm not sure that they really care about what other businesses are doing and what they think. I don't know. What do you reckon, Sarah?
Well, it's interesting, because power's sort of starting to shift as well. So some of these oil companies that were really, really dominant, and the top 10 are now shifting towards our tech companies. And so I'm wondering how much they're wanting to claw onto power as well, and amongst that. So actually letting go of a lot of that's going to make it even worse, or could actually flip and make them go, well, actually, we've really got to change. But the likelihood of that actually, the likelihood of a greenwashing is probably more prominent in
a lot of that.
Yeah. And especially, there's going to be interesting greenwashing around these current regulations is going to be quite interesting to watch as well. So no, in some ways I don't have much hope, but I think we've still got to rely on people and that landscape. If we're thinking, in terms of multi-level perspective, we really need the landscape to be shifting to put pressure on businesses to change as well. And that'll come through regulation and people. So it's a messy change situation, I think.
I think just going a bit further on that, I think these companies are increasingly holding on tooth and nail to their ability to make profits and have power. But my sense is that the idea that they will shift towards renewables, or I think they've demonstrated that we shouldn't sort of keep them in the conversation, if you like, in the hope that they will really change. I think it's time to accept that we need some of these multinationals to go broke and disappear because of their behaviour, basically.
I don't disagree. Ariane, you have a question?
Kia ora. Thank you, Alex. That was such an interesting talk. I think at the beginning you mentioned something about in the latest IPCC report, the insights regarding changing diets being left out of the policy makers' summary at the end, and the role of the New Zealand government in limiting that information. I wondered if you could perhaps provide some insight in regards to the way in which you mentioned that one of the biggest steps in getting that clause against lobbying in relation to the tobacco industry, getting the tobacco industry out of the room. How do you navigate the tension when the people bringing those issues to the table might be the government themselves?
Well, it's not entirely transparent and clear. To me at least, there might be someone else in the room with more knowledge about this, who is around the table and lobbying for how the summary for policymakers is expressed. But as I understand it, at things like the conferences of the parties, the for example, the New Zealand negotiating team will include a combination of politicians and senior policy makers, and some of those politicians and senior policy makers will have moved between industry and politics and policy, and then some important industry representatives. And so I think that it's not just like the Minister of Climate Change who's doing this lobbying, but not only that, but the Minister of Climate Change is being influenced by his senior policy advisors, who are in turn being influenced by industry. So there's direct and indirect influence happening here. And one of the things we can argue for is, for example, that the negotiating team doesn't have industry representatives on it, for example, and we can, and I think the government's being increasingly good at being transparent about who ministers are meeting with and how much time they're spending meeting with various parties. So I hope that helps, and there may be someone else who can add their expertise to that.
I think there's something, thank you, from Kyle on the chat there, which has got an interesting link there for 500 lobbyists from fossil fuel companies. Scary. James and then Janet for questions. Thanks.
Kia ora, and thank you very much, Alex. That was a very interesting presentation. My question is really a follow-up on Ariane's question. In terms of the assessment report and the sign-off process for that, as I understand it, each country has to sign off on it. So it'll be whichever New Zealand officials are involved in that process. And if I remember correctly, the minister, when the issue came out about plant-based diets, he sent a query back to officials to check what was going on. So I suspect it's at a lower level than him in terms of the sign-off process. My focus, I guess, was a bit more domestic rather than that international level. And I wondered if you have any insights as to the role of lobbying in domestic policy settings, either in terms of submissions to the Climate Change Commission, or government processes, or less formally. And I guess one particular question is in relation to groups like the Climate Leaders Coalition, and whether you see them as a force for change or a force to resist change. If you flick at their website, they list their members very proudly, and it includes Toyota, Z Energy, Genesis, Synlait, Fonterra, etc.
Yeah. Thanks for that, James. That big questions. So if we were just to take transport, then there is incredibly powerful lobbying going on in the transport policy space, from a group of the groups who are involved in that, a coalition of freight companies, the Automobile Association, which people think is the kind of nice car insurer and fixer-upper when you break down on the side of the road, but actually is essentially a lobby group for the car and oil industries, using their members as a front for that. There's, that's pretty clear from the money that they take from the oil industry, for example, and the way that they lobby. And then road and construction companies. So they're the three kind of most powerful players in the transport policy space from a vested interest point of view. And they do have a huge amount of influence because of the way that the Transport Fund is set up to recycle, directly recycle road user charges. So they have a lot of power over how that money gets used. And then in terms of the Climate Change Commission from a transport space, it was really disappointing to see that they have these expert advisory groups to different elements of policy within the kind of climate change advice, and that certainly when it was in the sort of the interim Climate Change Commission space, their advisory group for transport was entirely made up of sort of the vested interests in the status quo. So, and then there's this elephant in the room around agriculture that we do need to talk more about, because we know that that it's been agricultural industry lobbyists who have really blocked effective climate action over decades in New Zealand, much more importantly than oil and car lobbyists in Aotearoa.
Thanks, Alex. And I'll just add there that it is a classic business response to join an association like Climate Change Coalition to any sort of issue. Yeah, we've seen it time and time again around sustainability issues as well. Janet, a final question from Janet, just looking at the time. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks so much for that talk. I've long thought that the tobacco response and action to basically normalise non-tobacco situations is a classic good example of how we could address some of the climate change issues. So it's really nice to have that elaborated by you. I really enjoyed that, and particularly through I guess a cultural framing, I can see how the combination of activities that the government has put in place have actually changed, like they've changed the sort of physical material aspects of smoking, like, dreadful pictures and images on tobacco packets, and it's changed practices by eliminating smokers from spaces, and thereby changed norms. So now, I mean, if somebody smokes in my presence, I'm horrified rather than just sigh internally. But translating that to the, I guess, transport and the big issues there about, do we ban cars or some version of that? I think, to me, with a cultural lens, I think we've got to look beyond the power of the lobby groups, the vested interests, and think about how is this going to be perceived culturally by, say, New Zealanders. So the extent to which cars are fundamental to our recreational pursuits, our everyday working lives, how farmers operate, how we do our shopping, all of those things are so embedded, and cars are so much not only part of our identity, but part of our everyday life. And it's almost impossible to envisage for many people how one might live their life and be happy and satisfied with one's life without a car. So I think, to me, this whole issue needs to be addressed really carefully, because it risks an enormous backlash of sort of the groundswell movement times 100. If people feel that this fundamental part of their identity, everyday life, supporter of normal practices, is suddenly going to be made unavailable. I don't have any answers, but I'm just thinking that we can't afford to ignore the bottom-up response that could easily coalesce to a very, very negative space if we weren't careful.
I think that just there are some clear responses to that. I think I want to make really, really clear that that I haven't called for banning anything here, and that we haven't banned tobacco either, right? But also to acknowledge, as you say, that there's been a much more effective corporate embedding of car use into many aspects of our daily lives and into the fabric of our world. And it's been much more sort of multifaceted and sort of deeper than tobacco was. I mean, tobacco is kind of narrow practice, right? And it definitely came with some perceived benefits and sold benefits, but I think the tentacles of car dependence in particular are so much deeper, and that's been an incredibly effective strategy, and we need to see it as a corporate strategy over many decades since the Second World War, and I think that's why I'm arguing for starting with the small steps that will feel most egregious to most of the public. So I'm certainly not, we're never going to ban car use, and likewise we're never going to ban tobacco either. What we need to do is take some steps, some leadership steps towards gradually helping people recognise not just the harms of our car dependence, but also the egregiousness of the behaviour of corporations. Does that make sense? Mm. And then the waves of just small reductions in social license that come with that say, oh yeah, it isn't acceptable to block the centre of our cities with twin cab utes, right? That then leads to a willingness to create car-free environments in the centre of our cities, for example, or to lower speed limits, or to make space for bike lanes and reallocate public space. So again, I just want to reiterate those cycles that start with the most things that the public would see and agree as being egregious, into gradual changes in social norms.
Kia ora. I think that's a great place to finish, and some nice sentiments at the end. Thank you, Janet, for that question. But thank you, Alex, for this presentation today. As I said, in the comments, everyone has really enjoyed it. You've stimulated some great discussion and some great questions, which is what we all love. And we've got all sorts of claps coming up now. So thank you very much. Thank you also to Kyle for your comments as well. And I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Not driving too much.
Yeah, no, it's been a real pleasure. Ngā mihi nunui kia koutou. Have a great day, everyone.
Ngā mihi. Ka kite.